Good morning, everyone. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. In today's webinar, we shall discuss the ways to improve your inventory management process with effective measurements and KPIs. I'm excited to introduce to you our very own Jennifer. Jennifer, can you please introduce yourself?
Yep, no problem. Thanks, Gwen. Hi, everyone. This is Jennifer Izaguirre. I'm a practice director at Arqiva, managing group on the consulting side. I'm excited to be here with you and touch upon one of the key topics that we have at Arqiva.
Thank you so much for joining us, and we are very happy to have you. My name is also Winfred Amwako, and I'm the growth marketing lead here at Arqiva, and I'll be working together along with Jennifer today. Next slide, please. But before we get started, I would like to mention that if at any point in time you have trouble hearing us, please let us know by using the chat feature window in the GoToWebinar pane, and we will be sure to assist you. Also, we will reserve a few minutes at the end of the webinar for questions, so please feel free to enter your questions as you think of them using the GoToWebinar window. We hope you can take a few minutes at the end of the webinar to complete our feedback survey to help us ensure that you get the most out of our webinar. So to get deeper into today's discussion, I would like to give you a brief overview of Arqiva. At Arqiva, we believe that improved business performance starts with better planning. As a result, your Arqiva team has only one goal in mind: to ensure that you achieve better planning goals without forcing you to fit a software mold. We celebrate your unique business processes, and this gives you the power to keep your business processes intact. And so we start every Arqiva solution creation process with just one question in mind, and which is, how can we empower you with a better planning process? So our goal is to put you in the driver's seat to steer your improved business performance goals. Next slide, please. Arqiva One Plan sales and operations planning solutions are used by over 17,000 users worldwide in process and chemical and food and beverage, consumer packaged goods, discrete industries, so many different companies in different industries, with product revenues of over $50 billion. Over the years, we have expanded our reach. Arqiva is now global supply chains software planning provider with offices in North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific. So to do this, we provide one S&OP solutions, and we define one plan S&OP as an integrated demand-driven sales and operations planning process for dynamic business performance. Next slide, please. And this it promotes cross-functional synchronizations across companies, starting with integrated financial planning to demand inventory management to create a more dynamic S&OP management process using real-time dashboards. So in today's webinar, we will show our inventory management features with Arqiva, and this product is a part of our inventory planning solution. Next slide, please. So to give you a little overview of the Arqiva inventory management solutions, this solution helps you identify your optimal inventory levels by combining different inventory factors to create the real safety stocks, including demand variability, desired service levels, and lead times. Essentially, Arqiva tells you what, where, and how to stock up. How does Arqiva help you create an optimal safety stock level? That is straightforward. Our solution integrates with your demand, supply, and ERP data to help you optimize your safety stock levels across an entire network. With our robust inventory scenario builder, you can anticipate different scenarios, which is awesome. Next slide, please. So let's go into a little deeper into our solution. Firstly, let's start with the Arqiva Inventory Analyzer. This helps you get your inventory estimates right while also maintaining customer satisfaction levels. And also the Kiva multi-echelon inventory optimizer helps present a wide-ranging solution for optimizing safety stock targets by using proprietary inventory optimization algorithms that consider demand and supply uncertainties at each echelon and node. So next slide, please. So let's go into our discussion for today. And I would like to bring you, Jen, into today's discussion. Can you please walk us through the agenda for today?
Yep, no problem. Thanks, man. So today, as Gwen was mentioning, we're going to focus on inventory planning and key topics around inventory planning, but also within Arqiva. So as you can see, our agenda, the way that I want to go through it is do some discussions about the basics around inventory management, heavy focus on how we categorize it and classify it, and touch upon some of the top metrics and KPIs that are commonly used for inventory management. Towards the end, I saved some time to do a short demo of our application and essentially bring back those topics into how Arqiva has solutions to go through inventory management. Our focus is a lot of analysis, so let's just start with or set the ground around inventory by talking about just inventory and why do we need it. So knowing that inventory is essentially the stock that is available for your items or products at a specific locations, I want to ask, why do we need inventory, right? Some of the reasons that we can think of is, for example, we want to protect ourselves from different variabilities. So having a lot of variability in demand and lead time is something key in inventories, and one of the main reasons for having inventory. This is quite critical, especially at moments where we have great uncertainties. Also, inventory diminishes the effect of long lead times for supply and essentially restocking your inventory products. And one other reason is that it also allows us to take advantage of discounts for bulk purchasing products. So essentially, inventory is good. So we know that we need to have inventory, but it's also key to keep in mind that we need to have, but not too much, not necessarily too much, right? Then that is where inventory managers plays an important role. So for any company, firm, industry that holds inventory, managing an inventory is important, but also managing effectively. So a few of the benefits or reasons why there's an importance of having an inventory management process is that it benefits your operational efficiency and longevity. It also allows us to bring visibility to products. But first, I want to highlight that without inventory management, then businesses can see themselves facing loss of profit and also have an impact to the service for your customers. Okay. Inventory management, because it can bring a visibility to your products, essentially what you have, where you have it, also how much is coming. That visibility helps you essentially determining where you can reduce costs. It also allows you to essentially optimize the fulfillment of such stock, avoiding or preventing stockouts, and therefore improving your customer service. So in essence, an ideal inventory management process, we can see it as having the right stock, but also at the right level, the right place, time, and cost. That is essentially the ultimate goal, right? Okay. So essentially, before we get into some of the metrics and KPIs that I mentioned, and I know that one of the key areas for our discussion, I do want to emphasize or put some emphasis on one of those first steps of our inventory management process. Okay, so before we get digging into that, let's just then highlight that I'm going to talk about some techniques for categorizing or classifying our inventory. However, we do know that we have different inventory types. So having that in mind and knowing that we have types of inventories such as your raw materials, your finished goods, what you can define as work in progress or packaging goods, That is key, and that will be key for how you interpret the metrics and KPIs that we're going to talk about. In addition to that, it's good to also know that also depending on the industry, you have also inventory at different points of time. You have inventory that could be blocked for specific customers. You also have inventory that at a certain point in time is actually located in your quality assurance. So all of this plays an important role. However, I want to spend some time talking about techniques that where especially software is of great use to do some other type of classification. Okay. So there are several analysis and techniques that we can use. I'll talk about two of the most common, also fairly popular across different industries, starting with the ABC method, or what we call the ABC method. The ABC method is based on the economic formula, which is called Pareto rule or 80-20 rule. This Pareto, essentially what tells us, or the way to interpret it, is that 80% of a specific result could come from 20% of an action, or essentially that's where the 80-20 comes from. Bear in mind that this could vary. This is not a hard set rule. Depending again on your industry, depending on also, like I mentioned, the different types of inventory and products that you're analyzing, there could be some slight differences. But if we stick to at least this example, that is essentially what the 80 and 20 means, or how we can interpret it. So in case of inventory, one way that we can see it, and a very common way of using this 80-20 rule, is to focus on revenue, profit, or even the actual demand or usage of your inventory, saying that 80% of it, 80% let's say of profit, tends to be generated by 20% of your products or SKUs. So again, just to show or illustrate an example of this, if we talk about the A, B, and C classes, we can see that A is essentially that 80-20, the 20% of your SKUs or products represent the 80% of your revenues. Therefore, B could be 30% of your products, 15% of your revenue, and C, 50 and 5%. Then this sounds fairly straightforward and certainly not too complex. However, there's always advantages and disadvantages. So I just want to highlight on a few of them just to keep that in mind. One of the advantages is that it definitely it aids for demand forecasting by analyzing the products based on popularity, because essentially ABC, now that we know the basics of it, what it's telling us that it allows us to classify it based on a level of importance, right? So it also helps determine, based on that, it also helps determine tiered customer service and have a strategic approach around that. Some of the disadvantages is that it also could end up ignoring products that are just starting, and that also could start trending upwards. It does conflict with other inventory strategies, and one of the other key disadvantages is that it does require time. There's human resources and hours to spend into doing this analysis. If we think about a big portfolio where you have hundreds, thousands of SKUs, this is certainly analysis that could be time consuming. This is one of the main areas I'll talk about in the demo. Certainly one of the key things and one of the powerful functionalities that we have in our software, and where having a software that can automate these processes for you comes of a great advantage. Okay. Then the second technique that I wanted to talk about, because it helps and combines with ABC, is using variability method, fairly commonly called as X, Y, and Z, or LMH, but essentially uses variability of your demand. In this case, I'm going to talk about demand being essentially what your products have been, how have they been consumed or sold in history. As mentioned, it is a great additional layer to the ABC classification. Again, we'll also touch upon that within Arqiva. But what this does, it essentially using that variability or calculation of variability of your demand to split or classify your inventory in 3 new categories. So we can see as, for example, X or low, it's usually where you have a more regular demand, right? So less variability. It's a little bit more predictable and a little bit more stable. So essentially you can know and you know what to expect. Y or medium, you do start having a stronger variability in your demand. So it's not that steady. However, typically you know what are those factors that are giving you the variability, right? And then C or really high variability, it's fairly regular. It's the most difficult to predict. It's some of the ones that we end up calling or classifying as well as sporadic, and therefore forecast doesn't tend to be that reliable. Right? How do we, one of the ways that we can get and determine this variability is by using the coefficient of variation, or which is the standard deviation divided by the means. And like I said, this is heavily focused on your demand. Okay. And let me just get to the next slide. Okay, so now, before we get into the matrix and KPIs, so we just talk about, well, importance on inventory and of course the management of inventory. And if we think about those two couple of techniques that I just highlighted, we start seeing on how not only knowing that you have to measure inventory is important, but classification is key, because that will allow you, and as a planner especially, to invest your time and effort and put strategies around what is more important. And also, if we think about variability, it also helps us focus on what tends to be less predictable and where you have to have a little bit more control and monitoring in place. So for that, I'll talk about a few metrics and KPIs. As you can imagine, we all know there are multiple metrics and KPIs. Also, once again, we could vary depending on the industry. I will talk about a few of those, or at least highlight a few of those. Some of those that we tend to see fairly common, certainly on the supply chain world, they end up being very useful and important as part of your inventory management process. I think we might have a question. I don't know if, well, just wanted to check. I don't know when you see that there's any question that you would like me to jump into before continuing.
Yes, so there's a question here from one of our audiences. The question is, how is ABC classification a disadvantage or at odds with certain management approaches? And which approaches are you specifically referring to?
Let me just make sure. Well, I'm trying to think, because that will be helpful as well when we go into the demo. So if it's okay with you, well, sorry for the user that, or the person that attendee that raised the question, let me get back to it once we get into the demo. Just want to make sure that as well we have some visuals on, especially within the tool, on how we focus on this ABC classification.
Absolutely.
Awesome, thank you. Okay. Okay, then let's talk about our, like I said, just highlight some metrics. Just briefly go through those. Want to essentially put some wording around how they end up helping your inventory management strategy before we dive into the demo. Okay, so one of the most common metrics and measurements is inventory turnover. So inventory turnover is essentially the amount of times that your inventory is sold or consumed over a certain period of time. Here, the period of time, it's important to determine and make sure that it's clear to everyone that manages this measurement. Most typically, we consider 1 year as this time period, and that's the one that I'm actually using as a visual in this place. So essentially, this rate tells us how fast we are essentially selling our inventory. And it can be used, one of the uses that we've seen is that it can be used as a measurement for an overall business performance. Not necessarily the only use, but certainly it is one of the ways that it can give you an indicator for that. So for example, if we see that this inventory turnover rate ends up being a little bit on the low side, it could be a possible reflection of having weak performances. Just as an example, as we're focusing on supply chain, one way to calculate it is by just taking your sales divided by the average inventory, but focus on quantity of your items. Obviously, this formula and so many others that we talk about in terms of measurements and metrics, there is a focus on accounting. So you can also use this based on your cost of your average inventory or the cost of goods sold, but here I'm going to focus on the quantity and focus on from the supply chain perspective. So increasing your inventory turnover can certainly drive profitability, and essentially faster returns of your inventory can reduce holding cost, which therefore increases your net income and profitability, right? This measure, one thing to also emphasize, it can vary a lot depending on your industry. So something that we tend to recommend is that to do benchmarking. Comparisons against other industry standards, it's key, and certainly something that we encourage doing. Okay. Then this takes me then to average days of supply. So if inventory tells us how many times you're selling through an entire year of inventory, the average days of supply essentially tells you what you have on hand and for how many days you have it, or how many days you have for that inventory and how much it will last until you sell it. Okay, so straightforward, the calculation is you take your total inventory and divide it by your average daily sales. So again, this performance and this KPI can also be used on a cost or accounting point of view, and this can be measured by comparing and using as well a value of your inventory. Fairly simple, but very useful and effective as well, and especially in combination, but not exclusive, but in combination as well for your inventory turnover. Okay. Holding costs, I want to highlight holding costs, not necessarily because we want to get into the accounting part of this, but just want to make sure that it's also important to that we see the importance of having as accurate as possible a view of your holding costs, also known as carrying costs. Like I said, we're not gonna dive into any specific formulas, but just to highlight that typically the holding cost is an important percentage of your total inventory value. Therefore, having, like I said, a more accurate view and being able to determine what is included into your holding cost, which is a mix of fixed and variable costs, it is key as well for this overall visibility of your inventory. Some of the key things and aspects of why it's important to do this is that this could help figure out how much profit you can have from your existing inventory. It also can help determine even if you should have a decrease or increase in your production. So again, even holding costs, just want to highlight it because it does become a key and important aspect of your visibility of inventory and analysis around what you have on hand. Okay. Then we get into aging inventory and the age and how to report it. So I'll cover this in a couple of slides and essentially highlight a couple of ways that we see it be useful in monitoring your age. Sorry. So here I just focus on the inventory, the actual age, and based on it, essentially what we call slow movers. So for inventory age reports, which we'll also see in the demo, is that we want to define some buckets or essentially categories within the different ages that you can have in your inventory. So for example, we can have buckets that go to determine if you have from 0 or from 1 to 30 days, then 30 to 60, so forth, so on and so forth. So having those buckets defined is a really good way of using and starting to build some reporting and have visibility around your age of inventory. One of the key things about age inventory reports is that it helps measure as well the stock that has not moved, so therefore the slow movers, in a defined amount of days. You can also compare against your total stock, but essentially keep visibility to those that, again, as depending on the industry, you define as being slow movers. So monitoring this slow moving over time on top of it, not only the current moment, but being able to see how that has been trending, it can provide visibility of good inventory management as well, and ensuring that strategies and actions that have been taken are indeed working as expected. Okay. So let me actually go to the next. Then, so that in a way, the inventory, the age, or what we can call as slow movers, we tend as well to benefit from what I mentioned before in terms of inventory types and also classification, because you go to the detail, you go to your SKU, but you also have some different levels of grouping and analyzing your inventory in some more detailed form. However, that is not the only way that we can use age of inventory. At a summary level, it's also quite useful and provides advantage. So for example, your inventory at a summers level can provide essentially an additional check for your inventory health, and as well be able to see it across time and comparing it with history. In this example, what I want to highlight is that inventory age, or inventory average age, sorry, it's essentially the way that we calculate it essentially is your average inventory age weighted by its value or the amount of inventory batches. So I add the word batches because the inventory age analysis are most commonly used around products where you can in a way define batch. You can essentially be able to determine the age depending on the age of each batches for your product. So certainly this type of analysis, if you have those products, it's quite useful and quite important. Some other benefits of monitoring this age is that it can help you reduce some warehousing and storage cost. It also can, well, in a way, focus on increasing or aim to increase some cash flow, and also reduce the risk of factors that could reduce your increases of margins. Okay, so watching inventory age, just to summarize, in these different ways that I just mentioned, essentially can increase your sales, improve your cash flow, and even reduce expenses. Okay. So before we get into the demo, just to add a little bit more content to this, just want to highlight that you just saw that I briefly touched upon only 5, or maybe we can even group it as 4 metrics and KPIs. What we want to essentially highlight is that, 1, those are not the only ones that we have available in the market. Certainly they vary depending on the industry, but the other key thing is that in order to have an optimal management process, you want to use not only one metric. You don't want to focus or put emphasis on only one metric on KPI. We want to be able to find a good and optimal combination of these metrics and KPIs, and also be able and also use them depending on the different types of inventory and classification that you have. Okay, so let's go to the demo, and I already have Arkiva open, so I am sure that we have in the audience combination of people that are currently using Arkiva, or maybe you're brand new, I just have it by default in our starting page. I already loaded a few things that we have in this demo environment, but I just want to show you how softwares such as Arkiva can help automate these processes that we just talked about. So I'll talk about segmentation, which is essentially the functionality and component in Arkiva that allows you to quickly go through the different techniques. I just talked about ABC and variability. Like I said, not limited to just that, but essentially allows to do segmentation analysis to your inventory. So what I'm showing you here is your segmentation, typical view of your inventory. I just use a section of the data for the purpose of the demonstration. And you see that I already have some results where I can see at a very quick view in a pie matrix, the amount, essentially the splits between your ABC and variability classifications. Just quickly show you how interactive this is and how quickly you can use it to do the visuals. And then I'll show you how essentially this is also configured. Because I wanna see the importance not only of using the software, but also how easy and straightforward it is and quick to do this analysis to help what can be time consuming if it's done outside of a software tool. Okay, so within this type of view, what I want to show is that we do the analysis. You can do it at different, what we call levels of your inventory. But in this case, we will go to the details of what's straightforward products and locations. We do this type of analysis, and easily, once we have the results, be able to quickly focus on those that form the different classes that we have. Not limited just to that, we can say, well, I'm clicking and just selecting the 39% of my total products that end up forming my A classification. And what I'm using is my keyword to just click as well on what is determined as high. So this is just fairly easy, fairly straightforward, and puts the focus on what exactly forms this group. What exactly are we putting our emphasis on, because this technique is telling us that it has high importance, but also high variability. So fairly straightforward. What I want to show you and how this gets configured, just a piece of it, is to see, and this, like I said, I just did a very quick example. You can see, as I mentioned in the presentation, that you have a way of determining this splits, this 80-20 rule, because it's not a hard rule and it varies depending on your industry. You want to be able to have flexibility to define that split. So Arkiva allows you to do that essentially by changing and determining whether or not the split is the, let's say, is default one, as I showed you in the presentation. You have options to determine that. You also have options to determine and for sections of your inventory. So there's a lot of flexibility around this functionality that can be configured and tailored based on that industry and based also on the type of products that we're analyzing. Similar to variability, we have flexibility on configuration. One way of combining these two techniques, which I didn't elaborate too much in the slides, but I want to highlight here, is that we can have also quick visibility of what I like to call a bird's eye view on this mix of your ABC and XYZ or LMH classification, and based on the data available, in this case, your quantities of your historic usage, where exactly most in terms of quantity that usage falls. Really quick and easy, also dashboards to create based on that information that we're analyzing. Okay. And lastly, just want to show you that once we have this calculations, which you might have noticed already, but essentially that edit view that I displayed, once we have that configured, with just a push of a button, we run the calculation and gives us the analysis that I'm presenting you here. At the detail that we define it, which in this case is product and location, in really a matter of seconds, you have this analysis. This process is not just limited to that push of a button. I mentioned automation, and it's not just the fact that you're doing this ad hoc very quickly. It's also that Archiva allows you to program this calculation and determine with certain frequency when this analysis should run again, because we now have more knowledge about our products. Okay. So let me just also in essence of time, I want to continue a little bit more with the tool, and I'm going to go back to the questions that I see that we have a few questions regarding this already. So if we just want to show actually how the output of this segmentation and this classification is used for the metrics that we also talked about today. The segmentation module gives you that output. It tells you what are the different classes that you have for your inventory. Based in the example that I just showed you is in my usage was essentially how your product has been consumed in history. But like I also mentioned before, it's not limited to that. We can use revenue, profit, etc. So once we have that classification within Archiva, we have different ways of reporting it and using dashboards to also add more visual, not just the bird's eye view that I show you within the segmentation module, but also based on that classification, how do we essentially see and analyze what you have on hand? So good example is by using it just based on quantity, just exactly what, in this case, tons you have on hand and how that splits within your classification. But then we start also putting value to it, which is why I emphasize a little bit on costs, because we want to start seeing this monetized and have a different perspective of what we have on hand. In this type of report, which we call 9-cell analysis, we mention quantity, value, but also we do counts of your, in this case, SKU or products. Then we jump into another metric that I mentioned. We start also having visibility to your days of supply. So knowing as well and being able to calculate your average daily usage or demand, but essentially your historic use of your inventory for your products, we are able to determine essentially the days of supply that you have for what you have on hand. So again, see that this is it's a dashboard, right? So it's in a way a high level, not limited to that. You can also essentially slice and dice and filter based on specific products or specific locations that you want to focus on. Okay, just want to show the connection of this and use of the techniques with visibility and your metrics and KPIs. The next that I want to show is talking about the aging reports. So this is just for me to emphasize on the different buckets on age and put a visual on what I was describing before. This is a fairly simple but straightforward and very useful type of dashboard, where you see that we have those buckets predefined. We essentially focus on what has been or what inventory has less or equal to 30 days. Then you can have classification between 90 and 180 days, etc. Again, you see that here, not only focus on quantity, but also a focus on the value that this quantity represents. Just want to show how we even use also those different inventory types or product types within our reports. If you are familiar with SAP, you're familiar as well with this nomenclature, but essentially having also already in place and included in this type of report what is actually your raw materials, or being able to group it by raw materials or finished goods or work in progress allows to just easily focus on only that type of inventory. And as a planner, just have, based on your roles, have just a use of a same report, but easy flexibility to just focus on the section that you're managing. Okay. And then the other piece that I wanted to show about slow mover report, because I mentioned it, is that not only what you have right now, which is the previous report that I showed you, is just focusing on at this moment, where is my inventory in terms of the age. Another way of looking at it, and also once you have an inventory management process in place, is to be able to track this across time. So essentially in history, how have you been in terms of the different buckets of your age? So that way, when you define what exactly is a slow mover for your business, be able to see if the techniques and the approaches that have been taken are indeed having the impact that is expected, and how that slow movers are behaving across time. This is quite powerful and fairly useful, like I said, for different industry, because some of the strategies that we can think of is that you can then, by having this visibility, and then if where needed, going into the details on what that conforms these different groups and categories, it allows you to then determine strategies on how to sell those products, right? If you should have different strategies depending on the type of customer that buys those products. Because like I think at some point I also mentioned that this type of analysis, especially techniques, also help to build strategies around a tier approach that you might have for your customers. So if within your customer, you already see your customers within different tiers, then also knowing within those tiers how you can have strategies to sell the products are maybe moving a little bit lower or not, or essentially are being older or not, it will certainly help and certainly have a better impact to your profitability. Okay, then the last piece that I want to touch upon before we focus on the questions is, while I didn't highlight in terms of this particular topic today on metrics, we didn't touch upon targets of inventory, and certainly also how you can use safety stock, especially to help aid with that variability that we mentioned. I do, because we're in Arqiva, I do want to quickly show that one of the big components that we highlighted at the beginning of the presentation is how we can actually do inventory planning. So we have an actual planner that allows us to do calculations of safety stock and target stock. This is also fairly powerful. As mentioned, is separate from just doing analysis to your inventory, but where this comes in handy is when we start talking about optimization, and how do we start essentially projecting and being able to do analysis based on projections in the future. Okay, so let me actually make sure that I go real quick, because I'm seeing some of the questions. Okay, so yes, regarding the questions around ABC, essentially it is, so I'm gonna address different questions, but using the tool. There's a question around how easy it is to essentially do this analysis at different levels. The answer essentially fairly is easy, at least with a software and a tool such as the one that I'm showing you here. You can determine the different levels of analysis in a matter of creating what we call different views of segmentation. So you can have an analysis like the one that I'm showing, straightforward at the product and location. Maybe this is actually at SKU and location, but in addition to that, you can have another view where it's at a little bit more, I'm going to call it higher level of aggregation. So you can end up doing it based on maybe a region and not necessarily each individual locations, and maybe not your SKUs, but doing it on a different grouping of your products. It is indeed fairly straightforward, and we do encourage, especially those of you that use Arqiva, to do that type of analysis and not just be limited to one way of segmentating and running your calculations. So yeah, again, to answer the question, it's fairly easy. Honestly, it's just a matter of maybe a few minutes to actually configure it and run it and be able to have that output. Okay.
Hey, Jen, so just for
Yes.
the benefits of the rest of our audience, do you mind if I read a question out to everyone so that we can all be on the same page?
Yes, of course.
Okay, cool. So just in relation to the first question that you just answered, the question here is how easy is it to perform ABC or XYZ analysis at different levels of granularity? Example like SKU plant versus SKU dealership level.
Yep.
How easy is it to perform that kind of analysis with Akiva?
Yes, that is correct. Yeah, indeed. That is. Thanks for pointing that out. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, that is a question that I was addressing, and the answer, as I just mentioned, it's essentially fairly easy. A matter of, in terms of time, a matter of minutes, and in terms of configuration, this is also fairly straightforward and flexible. So I do. Yes.
We can take one more question before we give a summary of everything. Then we can open up the pipelines for everyone to just keep bombarding us with questions so that we can just follow up with the flow and answer our questions. So I'll take one last question before we go to the summary. So there's a question here about like how the calculation. The question is, how is the calculation for raw materials and intermediate items taken into consideration?
That's a good point, and why, at least within the report, I wanted to highlight how we use the different product types or inventory types. So if I stay within this view that I'm showing you, we also allow for some filtering and having calculations be different depending on that product type. Because if I think about my raw materials and intermediates, and I'm focusing on using history for my analysis, you don't necessarily have, it's not a cells, right, that you have. So therefore, in those cases, what we end up calling usage for your raw materials or intermediates ends up focusing on how your product has been consumed over time. Where has it gone within your production to be able to, essentially use that historic visibility to do the analysis. So in that's actually a really good question, because that's also why having a split, I'm calling a split of your different segmentation views, it's of great benefit, because then you can tweak not only the formula that you're using, but also what is the essential quantity that you want to use for it. Okay. So let me just, also the essence of time, let me just go back here and let's go to this next slide. So in summary, at least essentially for the topics that I wanted to talk about today. In summary, inventory, well, essentially protects our business from variabilities. I mentioned not only demand, but also lead time. It is important to have inventory, but not too much. Inventory management benefits your operational efficiency and brings visibility to your stock. Proper classification of your inventory, it is critical, and it's a critical foundation for your inventory management processes. Techniques such as ABC or variability for LMH classification, they're key, but also they depend and vary on your industry. And lastly, as part of a business model, the aim is to have an optimal combination of metrics and KPIs. Not just a few like the ones that I talked about, but a combination of other that allows you to have a more optimal process. Okay.
Whoa, so I would also like to say to everyone that if you're interested in receiving a personalized product demonstration on how Akiva can help you achieve a better planning process, please visit our website to request a demo or identify that during the webinar surveys that we would send to you at the end of the webinar. You can also email me personally, and I would be sure to make sure we send you a personalized demonstration. At this time, we would like to take some questions on, so please begin to send us your questions by going to the GoToWebinar questions chat window. Also, Jen, we have some questions from our audiences. Do you mind if I read it out aloud to everyone? Then you can just jump in and answer them. So sure. The first question here is from Derek, and he's asking, does this inventory tool interface with planning tools, example SAP, APO, or OMP? And also the next question is, can I easily bring together different metrics for causal relationship analysis, for example, lot sizes and effect on days cover?
Yes, thanks. So to answer the first part of the question, the answer is yes. Our tool, not just the inventory part of our tool, but our Kiva solutions do indeed have interaction and interfaces with tools and ERP tools, just an SAP. We also have, well, different ways of having that connection. We have an actual connector, for example, for SAP, that can be used to ensure that we have a quick and easy flow of the data from your ERP system. So certainly that's a key aspect of our planning tools. And the second part of your question, can I easily bring together different metrics? Yes, you can. In terms of the actual use, for example, of the dashboard that I was showing you, there are different ways of sourcing it and essentially not only bring the visibility that I showed you, because I know that was a very quick example, but yes, as long as we have the information from your systems, like your lot sizes, well, I mentioned at some point lead time. I didn't show that in the reports, but those inputs that we can provide to our tool are easily, we can easily bring visibility to them in the same reports that I was showing. So yeah, in summary, the answer is that yes, and that's typically how we use our Kiva tools.
Cool. Also, could you elaborate more on the relation of inventory and customer service level?
Yes. So in this case, yes, sorry that I'm reading the same question. In terms of the connection to customer service level, one of the ways that I at least briefly, and I understand that it really touch upon us, is that I'm using the last report that I showed for in terms of aging inventory, right? Being able to essentially improve our customer service by monitoring how your inventory falls in terms of age buckets allows you to improve your strategy on how to essentially sell those products to your customers. I did mention that that tends to become very handy when you have a tier approach to your customers. So for example, if you have customers that you know can only buy some products that are within only a few days of age, then you can build strategies around that, but also then separate those products that could go into a different tier of customers that could buy products that are, I don't know, more than 60 days old, just to give you an example. So that's one way on how this can help with your customer service, but mainly the strategy on your sales. And the quick thing, the only other use, especially on segmentation for your customer service, is that having an ABC and XYZ classification, we, especially within our Kiva, typically use that classification to determine if, for example, we need to focus on having high customer service level for those products that fall into A and high variability. So it just helps a little bit more on the strategy, just to ensure that we focus on those products that require more of an attention.
Cool. Also, what type of data sets did you use, and are there business rules also defined in this visual creation that you did?
Sorry, Wayne, do you mind repeating the question?
So what type of data sets are used? Also, are business rules defined?
Data sets, well, at least if I focus on the demo that I was showing you, some of the data sets that we tend to use, I think I mainly mentioned it, I call it usage, but essentially it's bringing, however you can determine the way that your products have been used. So I focus a lot of history, right? And essentially how your products have been sold, how they have been consumed, sorry. But again, it's not necessarily limited to that. Another data set is indeed using your profits and revenue. So as long as, if we think about our Kiva and how we use our Kiva for that, as long as we have that information coming in from like I said before, your ERP system or any other input, then we are able to define that as a good and useful data set for this. But typically, in terms of another way of seeing that is for inventory, we focus on products or SKUs and your location. So that, in terms of level of analysis, it's typically what we configure in an inventory module.
Well, I think we can take one last question because we're running out of time.
Mm-hmm.
So how does demand variability affect your stock levels?
So demand variability, which is certainly key and important, especially now, it has a direct impact, right, on our inventory, because essentially how I see it is that it gives us it's a high risk of shortages. So being able to monitor that and essentially predict inventory, it will become very key. So because it has an impact, a direct impact on shortages of your inventory, certainly being able to find a way to reduce the variability is important. So this is why, as in supply chain, and in general, not just an inventory management process, that's why we also focus on forecasting. So this is where being able to do a good and proper forecast of your products and be able to also put emphasis on that, then we are striving for having less variability and be able to be prepared for the impacts of this. So within Arqiva, we also have, I know that that's not the focus on this demo, but we have tools that are very heavy on using good statistical modules and methods for doing this forecasting process for your demand.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for helping us out. Also, I would like to mention that we are going to send out a recording of today's discussion to everyone on this call, as well as those who couldn't make it today. We'll send it out in a couple of days, just so that we can work on the back end to make sure everything looks good on the presentation. Also, at the end of today's webinar, we will be sending out a survey. So if you like us to send you a demonstration or a copy of this presentation so that you can use it to educate your team members as well as upper management, we will be sure to send it out to all those who are interested in it. And I would like to say thank you all so much for taking the time today to join us. You can always go to our website, arqiva.com, to view a list of so many products that we have that we can help your business with. So thank you so much.